Hello everyone and welcome to the Safety and Compliance Center. This is Bilal Khan and here I will simplify NEBOSH IGC course for you. I'm very confident that by the end of this session you will have much better understanding of the topic if you will interact with the exercises given between the sessions. We are going to discuss about the key topic, the occupational exposure limits. We will break it into the simple terms and talk about the difference between the short-term and the long-term exposure limits, why we use the time-weighted average, and what are the limitations of these exposure limits, and how the international standards come into play with how the safe levels of exposures limits are actually set and what they really mean. There is no single global standard. Different countries set their own exposure limits based on their national guidelines, the scientific research, and the workplace practices. For example, in the UK, they are called the workplace exposure limits. These are legally binding under the OSHA regulation that's control the of substance hazardous to health. Simply put, the workplace exposure limit set the maximum amount of hazardous substance that the worker can be exposed to, and the limits must not be exceeded over a defined period of time. So, while the idea is same globally to protect the workers, the actual numbers and the rules can vary depending on where you are. So, what exactly is a workplace exposure limit? Here is the official definition: is the maximum concentration of an airborne substance average or a reference period to which employees may be exposed by inhalation. In simpler terms, it's the highest amount of a hazardous substance that can be present in the air, which a worker can safely breathe in, averaged over a set time period. The short-term exposure limits are based on a 15 minutes time, and they are designed to protect the workers from the acute effect like dizziness, the headache, irritation that can hit quickly after a high exposure. So the short-term exposure limit deal with the situation where a worker might be exposed to a very high concentration of a substance, but only for a shorter period of time, while the long-term exposure limits are based on the 8 hours workday. They are all about preventing the chronic effects, the health issues that develop slowly over the time due to lower levels, and the long-term exposures. Why do we even need these time-weighted averages like the short-term exposure limits and the long-term exposure limits? We will think about a typical workday. A worker might be exposed to different levels of hazardous substance at different times. It's rarely constant. That's where the time-weighted average comes in. The short-term exposure limits helps the protect the workers from short bursts of high exposure that could cause the immediate acute effects like nausea or the eye irritation. And the long-term exposure limits protect against the long-term lower-level exposures to stop the chronic effects like the respiratory issues or organ damage that build up over a period of time. So the time-weighted average is a way to balance out those ups and downs in the exposure, making sure it stays within the safe limits overall. Now, here is something important. Just because exposure is below the limit does not always mean it is completely safe. Let's talk about few key limitations of these exposure limits. First, they usually only look at the inhalation, but what about the skin contact or the ingestion? That's not always covered. They do not take into account the individual sensitivity. Some people might react with strongly than others, even at the low levels. The limits often ignore the synergistic effects that when the multiple substances interact with, and become more harmful together than they are alone. The fourth is the limits assume normal environmental conditions. If the temperature, the humidity, or the ventilation changes, the exposure risk might increase, even if you are under the limit. And finally, not all the limits fully cover every possible health effect of a substance. Some may focus on just one risk like respiratory irritation while missing other like long-term organ damage. So while the exposure limits are super useful, they are not foolproof and should always be used with good judgment and other safety measures also. Let's zoom out a bit and look at how the occupational exposure limits are handled around the world. In the UK, we have got the work exposure limits enforced under the OSHA regulation. Across the Europe, they use what's called the indicative limit values, which help guide member states in setting their own national limits. Now, over in the United States, it's get a bit more layered. The ACGIH sets the threshold limit values. These are widely respected, but it is not a legally binding. And NEOSH recommends the recommended exposure limits, again guidance, but not a law. And the AIHA provides the workplace environmental exposure limits, often for substances not covered elsewhere. And finally, the OSHA sets and enforces the legal limits called the permissible exposure limits. But here is the bottom line: there is no global standard. Each country or region develop its own system based on its own research, industries, and policies. So, if you are working internationally, always check the local regulations. They can vary more than you might expect. Before we finalize this lecture, I want to hear from you also. Take a moment to think about these questions. What are the occupational exposure limits? What are they called here in the UK? And what's the difference between an 8 hours time weighted average and 15 minutes short term exposure limit? Drop your answers in the comment section below. I will be reading you and replying it. Let's get a conversation going on in the comment section below. Thank you very much for watching this video from the Safety and Compliance Center. If you have any question regarding this session, please drop your questions in the comment section below. I would love to answer that. This is your channel. Like it, subscribe it for more safety content. Stay safe, stay blessed, and goodbye.